It's good to be here. And Polly, it's great to share this with you. I just learned, we just are recent friends, I think, through being online, but it's really been fun to, I just got your book of the Occultist and I'm so thrilled with it. It's just such a neat book. So I'm really pleased to be able to share the evening with you.
Thanks for that, David. I appreciate that. I'm the same. I'm new to your work as well, and I quickly bought your book and read as much of it as I could, and I was just knocked out by how amazing it is. I can't believe we've sort of missed each other for 15 years or so in Asheville, but I mean, I think that's a testament to Asheville. There's just so much creativity and so many wonderful artists around that there's always somebody waiting to be discovered, and so I'm happy to be in your company.
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right. It is kind of funny that we haven't met in other ways, but you're right. It is, Asheville is just that way. And I was curious. I'm thrilled, and I want to learn a lot more about not only your writing but your film background. But these things have to merge, and I wondered. I can't help but think that when you're writing, you're seeing your story. I mean, it seems like film is probably going to spill over into your writing. Does it work that way for you?
Well, it does. I mean, the Occultists, here's a copy right here. The Occultists was actually first conceived as one of those 8-episode short series, almost like True Detective on HBO. Mm-hmm. And I actually had written the first 2 episodes and even actually won some awards on it. But I got frustrated because obviously it's a period piece. It's set in 1904, actually. And if you have a period piece, that means everything is expensive. I mean, you've got to get Model Ts, you've got to get extras dressed up in 1904 costumes. So every single thing becomes really expensive. And I knew that I could either spend years trying to get this made, which I've done before, or I could just write it as a novel. And of course, writing books was my plan A, which plan B was to make films, which I went off and made a lot of films, or made several films. And so really, I returned back to my original plan of writing a novel. And it was a lot of fun because there wasn't a budget. Like in film, you say, well, I want to do this and this and that, but I don't have the budget for it, so let's just kill that idea. Well, in writing, you don't have to do that. There's no budget. You can imagine a tidal wave overturning an ocean liner if you want. So it was really freeing in that way. I was able to just have a lot of fun, and just play. And it actually ballooned because screenwriting is so limited, like your script has to be 100 pages or less. There's such a premium on space and time that with the novel, it just kind of ballooned out. And I think it ended up being like 160,000 words. And my publisher said, yeah, you got to cut it. We can't do that because then it's going to be like making the font really small on the page and stuff. So yeah, so I just had a ball with that. It was really great, not having any sort of fetters on my imagination,
Well, it's great. It's really good. I mean, I see it like a movie when I'm reading it. So that's why I think you have to have that quality that's going in there. And when I'm writing, I see the things, it's like a movie for me too. And I kind of hope that it comes across that way as like creating these scenes. But with your film, well, the way that your film history integrates with your writing, I mean, it seems very visual to me, but it also is very literary. And I like the turn of phrase. I like the way that in fact, I'm envious of that. As soon as I picked up your book and started reading it, and I went, oh man, I feel like I can tell a story. And I like to build characters, and I like to build suspenseful atmosphere. But I don't know, even though I'm an English teacher, I don't know that I feel like I have that turn of phrase, that it's the language itself that has some beauty. And I really appreciate it when people do. Ray Bradbury could do that so well. I mean, often, that's why I included him in the list of authors that are influential. That's often like poetry in there. And you did that too. And right off the bat, I mean, just in the first couple of chapters, and I went, wow, not only do I like this, I envy Polly with this skill of a turn of the phrase. In fact, I mean, I wasn't going to do this right off the bat, but it just came to me. I wanted to mark them because I wanted to share just those things that there are just a couple of phrases there that really struck me that I really liked. Just a couple of, and I won't be giving away any plot. I'm very careful about that because I don't want any spoilers in here. But your character Max, and I love the name Max, and I don't know if this was deliberate at all, but it brought me back, even though your Max is a lot older than this other Max, but of Where the Wild Things Are. It's just, I've always loved Max and I always think of that when that name comes up. But anyway, Max was getting ready to go to sleep, and you phrased it as the night train of his awareness chuffed away into the misty dark. His last thoughts were of the man in the turban. What a neat way to talk about going to sleep. That was just so cool. And there's just two more. I want to say these other ones real quickly if I can. Your phrasing of then in waking up in the morning, the light from the window was still timid and brittle, and the room, Max noticed with embarrassment, smelled like sleep. I mean, the light was timid and brittle. And I read that and I went, oh man. I mean, it's simple. It's not this grandiose language, but it's such, you nailed it. It was just such a beautiful way to phrase that. And it seems like there was, one more, was your setting, your place of Selford, Georgia, you say was settled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains like a toy lost in rumpled bedclothes. Polly, those are great. Those are just great. And when you can tell a good story and you also have the language, well, my hat's off to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Your work is great too. I mean, one of the real dangers of filmmakers who write is they don't get into that interiority, is what I call it, the psychological, kind of story. And the stories I read of your work were just really great. And there was a lot of interiority. I mean, you really spent a lot of time delving into their psychology and what they felt. A lot of times screenwriters will be like, he went in the door, he sat down in the chair. Everything is very external. It's very action-based. But your work is nicely psychological and, focused, as much as anything else on the inner states of your characters. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I do like that. I do feel like that's a part of to me, what makes a story really good, because I think you have to have characters that you care about. And for horror, you have to have characters that you like, and you have to have characters that you hate, probably, or at least that instill some fear. And so thinking about the backstory, I don't know how much I deliberately or sit down and create the backstory until recently. And I haven't written the novel that I've been wanting to write for years and years and years and years, but it's in my schedule. I'm finally going to do it. And I'm glad that I waited, because I feel like the short story format helped me to develop the skills that I wanted to find my voice and to find that character building and not spoil the book idea that I have by doing it too soon. But it just developed that I'm recently writing things for the podcast. I started doing the stories that I'd written from 13th Day of Christmas and Tales from the Hearse as individual stories. Just that was the podcast. And we put some wonderful music to it by a dark ambient musician named Mombi Ullman. And we did a season. I did 13 stories. And then the second episode, I found one of Mombi's albums that was a Halloween album. And I said, what if we took that soundtrack and we made the story out of that? So the second season is Witchworks. But to create the new characters for that story, I had to create backstory in a way I'd never done before. I had to figure out, well, what is this character's history that maybe people don't need to know, but I need to know it. And and a family history ended up being important. And I ended up with charts that I was, had to do the family history, genealogy and whatnot. Nobody needs to know that. And I don't think they would ever guess that sort of thing exists, but I had to have it in order to plot that out of what was going on. And I thought, boy, people that really do this, that's amazing. But it was very important to know where that character was coming from so I could know where I wanted to take him.
So you had the whole family tree laid out there.
I did. I really did, because it was a character. The story's called Witchworks, and that character lived in a little North Carolina town, but it wanted to get away from a father who, if not outright abusive, was still very strict and seemingly uncaring, unemotional dad, and he just needed to leave. but at his father's death, he has to come back. And then we find out that there's something that's been looming over them, literally, the Black Cat Toy Factory, the ruins of this mysterious toy factory that's just above their farm. And it's had in its hold on the little town of Maria Bay. So I had to figure out, well, what's his history? What was the connection of the family to this toy factory? Why is there a toy factory? It's burned down and they got the ruins of it that are left, but what's the impact of that? And what is significant about, all of these demons that we have, that we've grown up with, that we're dealing with, that surface because of the horror of the story, but they're already there often, and then we're having to confront those. So having to figure out what those were, and then how this external, almost superficial horror kind of, pulls those out of us. So
Right.
that's kind of a fun way to do it.
So your horror is rooted in character. It's all
I'd
about
say that's really true. I think so.
Yeah. I think that's a higher level of horror. It's almost like Raymond Carver meets horror, or Eudora Welty meets horror. You know what I mean? It's about people. It's people first and foremost, and then if you can throw in a scare or two, that's okay. But it's really about people, and I really appreciate that. If you know of another Asheville writer, his name is Nathan Ballingrud. And he is like that. He's very much a working class writer, very much like a Raymond Carver meets werewolves. And it works. It works. The guy's nuts. He's really great. And so I really appreciated that about your work. I mean, Stephen King does that too, about, he famously said he spends the first 100 pages of his novels getting you to like his characters, and then the last 300 pages sending them through hell. And I really sense that about your character too. Like, forget the name of it. I've got it on my phone because I'm a Kindle reader, or an ebook reader rather. I read the story about the lady who walks along the beach, and the Gray Man is what it's called.
The Gray Man, yeah.
The Gray Man. Oh my God, what a scary story that is! It's horrible. And there's this ambivalence about whether the Gray Man is going to be helpful or not.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I don't want to give it away, but it's a really terrifying story, and it's all rooted in the fact that you really, really care for your protagonist so much.
Well, I do that. I'm really glad that came across that way, because I really like that story, and it was recently rejected. When you get these rejections and try to put them in different places, and you go, "Oh man, that's such a good story, though," and then you doubt yourself and go, "Well, maybe it isn't." So it was really nice to hear that you enjoyed that story too, because I like it. I think it's one of the best stories in the book, because there is this character who, it's not a spoiler to say that she's lost her husband and she lives on the coast. And if you've been to the North and South Carolina coast, you've maybe heard of the legend of the Gray Man. And the Gray Man, this mysterious figure that appears often right before a catastrophe of some sort, often hurricanes and different things. So sometimes, like you said, there's sometimes a harbinger of that maybe something is going to happen, but it's a warning. And so you have that. So I wanted to play with that Gray Man idea, but it was really this poor woman who was suffering a loss of her husband, and yet here she is, and it's the anniversary of his death that story takes place on, here on a coastal, in a little tourist place on the coast, but the tourists are gone. It's after she's going to be there. Fall is often an interesting time at the beach, I think. It's beautiful, but in a very melancholy way. I wanted to kind of capture that feel too. So yeah, that's that story. But yeah, it was really about her and her loss.
Yeah. Do you write about the South? Do you consider yourself a Southern writer?
I am finding that I think, yes, that I didn't set out, but I've realized that I'm putting all my stories in the South. I'm setting them here. In fact, kind of almost, I don't know if I have well, I do have exceptions, because in the Christmas books, I sometimes put them, well, I've got a story that's a timepiece that's in Bulgaria, like in the early 1800s. So not always in North Carolina, but frequently. And I think that is going to be, that's definitely a trend for me to do that. And I like that. And that is the South. Those are my roots. I don't know that it's always that voice, but it seems like it keeps coming back. And maybe that's the people, those are the people I know the best. So I kind of go there. I did want to mention, and I imagine you've had this happen too. a character that really moved me that I created. And when you get so caught up with your characters that you really care about them, the title story for the 13th Day of Christmas is really a novella. There were 12 stories, and then that one's a little bit longer. And the central character in that story, I cared so much. It's just like what you said about with Stephen King. I create this character that you care so much about, and then I put them through hell. I felt so bad about, I really did. And I would find myself moved about what was going on with this character, because it's a novella. So it was more than my short story characters. I can deal with this, and they're powerful. But when you take a character through something that long, or a little bit longer than certainly a short story, you get wrapped up in them. And I felt bad about the things I was putting that character, because I cared about that character.
Yeah, I've been there. I remember writing a scene in which I did something really, really bad to one of my beloved characters, and my adrenaline was up. I mean, my heart was racing, my adrenaline was up, and I had to get up and walk around for a little while just to get the buzz off of it, because it was like, wow. I mean, these characters become so real to us. And you spend so long with them when you do like really horrible things, the kind of things that you wouldn't do to your worst enemy, because you're telling a story and you want a dramatic reaction, and it's just heartbreaking, but that's what we got to do.
Yeah, that is what we do. It is interesting to hear you go through the same thing, because it is a definite phenomenon of that. And I wanted to, now, I don't know, we're leaving other folks out of the discussion, and I keep coming up and thinking about questions. And I wanted to ask you, Polly, if it's okay, and I'm not monopolizing the discussion, I wanted to ask Polly what you thought about writing horror, and if you've ever questioned yourself, like, why am I, because I've done this for myself is why I say that, but I'm curious about your answer. Why am I so into horror? Why am I so into scary stuff?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a loaded question for me too. I've mentioned this before in other things, but I don't consider myself really a horror writer. For the simple fact that about 15 years ago, my wife was in a workplace shooting here in Asheville. Oh. Her boss was shot, like basically right in front of her, shot to death. So for about 10 years, I didn't need horror. I put it aside and was reading, Flannery O'Connor or whoever. Filmmaking, of course, kept me very busy. But so for a long time, I didn't write horror, and only recently did I come back to it. It's just fun, I think it does help with a catharsis. Like, so before we actually went live just now, we were talking about the upcoming election and how the election may be true horror. And so now we kind of need a little bit of this fake pretend horror just to give us a little release. So I think that's why I like it. And also, it's just fun, you get to really exercise your imagination. You get to create these beings that don't exist and do all kind of crazy things with them. And so I'm actually working on a YA fantasy right now with deep horrific incidents, or deep horrific, what's the word I'm looking for? Just, the flavor of deep horror. And it's a lot of fun. My brain just goes there instantly. So what about you, David? Why do you write horror?
I was really kind of challenged by why I kept thinking about this. Why am I into that so much? And I think sort of what you're talking about, but also the fact that this is horror that I can control. I don't know that I had that thought before, but as you said, this 2020 has just been a nightmare in so many different ways. And I can't control those things. And I get really frustrated with the situation of how can people not be compassionate? How can people not care about each other? How can people be so self-centered and narrow in their views? And it's very frustrating. But the horror that I write, I can control. Right. And I feel like even when it goes really dark and it doesn't end in they lived happily ever after, which is very, very rare for me to do. It was control. And even when I'm reading it, because I've always loved reading horror, it's still, you can close the book, when you're done. You can enjoy, like you said, the first of it was because it is fun. I mean, it's a haunted house attraction that's
Right.
all you and the author and what's going on there. But you do have that control over it. And I kind of think that too, to get a little bit deeper,
Go
I
for
I just think that the ultimate thing that we all have to deal with, of course, is the horror of death. And
mortality.
it's frightening, and we don't know, and we have, perhaps many of us have faith about what may happen, and but yet at the same time, the bottom line is we don't know, and it's
Right.
terrifying. It's terrifying. And I wanted and needed some way of dealing with that. And I think I talk about my love of Halloween, and you mentioned it, Stephanie, in the author bio. I think that's another reason why I'm into that, because again, it gives me control over that. And I can finally say to death, it's just a part of life, and it's something I can even make fun of and have fun with. But it is a part of things, and I can bring it in without it necessarily being this terrifying figure. I like to make it a terrifying figure, but it's something that I somehow put it into, put some reins on it that I can pull in a little bit. I think that's what it's about for me.
Very interesting. Well, you've had a long and storied career as a teacher. I had some friends of mine contact me and say, "Let me tell you some fun stories about, about David Voyles." And so I want to hear some of your teaching stories, and also want to hear about your hearse and that whole thing. That's really cool.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me go in the order you just did that, because I think it kind of ties in. I've loved teaching, and I love literature, and the main thing about it was to get students turned on to reading and realizing how reading can open up so many different worlds for you. But when I had the chance to do some spooky stuff, I seized it. So in the semester, when first semester of school always had Halloween, I just wanted to run with that. And so I would do, always Halloween day, if it fell during the week, we would have spooky stories, and I would do a character, and I would bring in something. I remember I had this, one of my favorite things to do in the classroom that way is I had an old corduroy jacket, and I had this big plastic, realistic looking rat, and I put it on the back of the coat so that I couldn't see it, but it was on the back of the coat. And I did this whole thing with the class for a while, and then I turned around and wrote on the board, and of course there was the rat. But the story that I wanted to share with them was called Graveyard, what's the name of it? A great Henry Kuttner story, Graveyard Rats. It's a wonderful, scary, spooky short story about this thief, this guy who runs the cemetery, but he's a grave robber, and he waits till the family leaves, and he goes and digs up stuff. And he finally has this horrific experience with the graveyard rats. Well, I read that story, but I had the graveyard rat. It was fun to start bringing things in. Then it got to the point when I taught world literature that we would just do excerpts from great pieces, but we would cover Dante's Inferno, and I wanted to introduce students to that. So I turned my classroom into a haunted house attraction. I put the strobe lights, I put eerie haunted house music, in the speakers, turned off my lights, of course, to the strobe lights, shooting out into the hallway there, had a figure, a dummy with the devil in the corner and all that, because basically I feel like Dante was working on lots of different levels. Of course, it's allegorical, but at the same time, on a very basic level, it was a haunted house. It's, hell, and this is, a frightening thing. So on a very Christian level for Dante, I'm sure he had that message. He had a very political message too. But anyway, to get that whole idea, and he had before you even went in, before Virgil and Dante descend into hell, they have to listen to the sounds of the wailing. So you have the audio first, which just was perfect. That's what I emulated too. So you could hear things before you even went into the classroom. And the students, when they were getting ready to come in, it was just really fun to see their reactions. It was just like a haunted house. Like they were waiting to see, well, who's behind the door, who's behind whatever the freaky thing's getting ready to happen. So it seemed like only a natural thing when I retired, and we've always had really cool Halloween parties with things. And my son is in his 30s now, has grown up with that. But after a themed Halloween party that we did at our house called Dark Tours, where we had little scenes set up and you went around and I told stories for the scenes, we said, what would be really fun is to, get a hearse. If we'd had a hearse for people to ride up to the party, we live up on a hill, that would be so cool. And then we said, I bet you could do a tour with a hearse and drive people around. People love the stories. They love being told stories, which at that Halloween party, you could just tell, even as adults, people love that experience. Well, that night was the birth of Dark Ride Tours. And we started looking for buying a used hearse, obviously an older hearse. We got one that definitely was a challenge to try to renovate. But for 3 years, we did run the tour, and it was wonderful. We could take 8 people, 6 people comfortably, 8 people. And if everyone knew each other and didn't mind, they could pile in for 10 people. In the back of the hearse, there was a flat screen TV sitting on a part of a coffin. So we could stream things live. We could talk, have also video that had already been recorded. We could make ghosts appear, sounds of ghosts in the hearse. And we had another screen actually behind where the driver was, so a ghost could appear there. It was just so much fun to do the fulfillment. So I feel like my life and my professional life as a teacher and doing those things, and then it became at retirement to just embrace the Halloween element and the ghost storytelling. And that, when we finally decided, well, we've either got to end this business or expand it. And we weren't gutsy enough, and a good thing coming with what happened with COVID, or we would have gone under if we'd taken a loan out again and tried to expand it. So who knows what was working with us there. It was a fortunate thing we didn't do it. But it was very melancholy, or a very bittersweet thing to give it up. And yet I felt like I've got some stories to tell. Why don't I try writing them and put them together? And I did the Christmas one first because we were ended at Christmas time and the holiday season. And I thought, well, let me do that. But I will say the stories in 13th Day of Christmas are much, much darker than the ones I could tell on the tour, because I had to be, I didn't know what age children might be with us on any given tour. So I had to kind of keep it a little bit light, but I darkened it up for the story, and I had to add new stories. So the 13th Day of Christmas has some stories. There are about three stories in there that are maybe close to what I told, but most of them are a lot darker. And the Tales from the Hearse is the same way. They're much, much darker, but they're inspired by the idea of, would you like to hear a story? Come into my hearse and let me tell you a little story. Let's go for a ride in the graveyard.
That sounds like so much fun. I'm so sorry I missed out on that. That sounds incredible. And the stories from Tales from the Hearse, they are really dark. They have teeth, they really do. I mean, they have the sense of fun that you want in a story, but these stories bite. They bite. They're like vicious stories. They're not stories that you're like, oh, that's a quaint, fun little thing. They're not at all. They're actually pretty dark stuff.
Yeah,
they
really
I mean, it's like you put your money where your mouth was. That was really.
I appreciate that. And that is I think a very apt description of it. There were a couple that they're even darker than what I could tell with maybe the violence that happens. Although most of my violence, I think this is a accurate statement, is implied rather than told. A lot of things happen, they're built up, and then you have that. But there's some gory things from time to time, but if they are there, they're very quick. Because to me, it's all the atmosphere of the horror. Like a haunted house, a really good haunted house, to me, is the anticipation. Anybody can do jump scares. Same thing's true about horror movies. Anybody can do and make you jump in your seat without any skill at all. But to get an atmosphere that's created that makes you so creepy and your skin's crawling and there hasn't even been anything saying boo or jumping out at you yet, that's the challenge. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with my writing as well. So with the stories, that's, I'm glad that at least seemed to come across.
It did. There's a real sense of dread there, a real masterful grasp of tone, I would call it, and it did remind me of Stephen King in all the best ways. The stories I read were very, placed in kitchens and in closed bars and, bars that were empty and very matter of fact locations. But the dread was always there too. So well done, sir.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And I am looking forward to doing some more. I think the podcast has pushed me into a different experience and some more challenges. It's kind of like what you were talking about with film writing, where you're kind of limited, because I, for the most part, tried to keep things to 20-minute episodes that, with attention span and so forth. And I broke the rules for myself on 2 occasions and went twice as long and thought about breaking it up, but I also have kind of a trademark where I want things to have 13 chapters or 13 episodes. So I had to cheat with that a little bit. But I want to do a new one and do the same sort of thing of based on the album, based on some music that already exists. Mamba Ullman has created like a soundtrack for a movie that's not there, and then I get to write the movie. So he has another one that's set in the Appalachian Mountains and called it Wraiths of the Appalachians. And it's got all these wonderful cryptid stories and folk tales and Brown Mountain Light, all kinds of things. And I wanted to pull them together with a frame, you know, a frame telling a character that's going to have to travel all these things. And each episode has one of those, and follow the tracks on the album again. It's really, really a fun thing to do. But once that's done, I really want to get to the big novel, and then I'll see, like, I feel like I've been prepping myself for this for a long, long time, and hopefully not building myself up. And I hope to come to you, Polly, afterwards. I won't make people listen to this, but I'm going to ask for some advice because it's going to be a period piece and I need some help. You did such a cool thing with, and I'm still in the midst of it, but with the occultist of the time frame. And so having to research and get a feel for what that time period is like and get your reader to be immersed in it is a challenge. That's another whole level. Was that hard for you to do?
Yeah, it was hard because, you know, you can go down a rabbit hole with research, you know, especially something like 1904 where there's no like recorded catalog. I mean, I would find myself doing like a Google Images search of women's outfits from 1904 with big hats, you know, and the belts and the bustles. And I know a lot more about carriages from that time period than just about anybody you know. But it's a lot of fun, but it's also kind of a burden because you can't just rely on your instincts. You can't say, you know, he opened the door and walked in, because there might be a, you know, who knows how the door opens. There might be a special doorknob or something. So you really have to clarify every step along the way. And, you know, the book took a little bit longer too, because I originally wrote it in the style of the writers who lived back then. I wrote it in sort of an H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Algernon Blackwood style, where it's kind of stodgy, like a gentleman's club storyteller, and it had this kind of gentle tone, and you know, it took a long time to get to its point. It was very wordy, and then after about a year, I realized nobody's going to want to read this thing because nobody reads those guys anymore, except just as an academic exercise. So it took me a long time to kind of update the tone, but find the right voice for it, because you don't want them to say, "Hey, looky there, pal," because it's in 1904. But at the same time, it's got to have a sense of modernity to it. So it was kind of fun, you know, like finding that exact right tone. And I found it like I would change the language a lot. I would get rid of all those dime words and nickel words and bring them down to a penny word, just like a 1-syllable word. If there was a 1-syllable word I could use, I would go for that. Keep it very simple. And one person remarked it was almost like a YA book in the sense of how simple the language is and how just, you know, almost rudimentary the storytelling is. And that's very much by design. You know, you want it to be accessible, but not so accessible that it is easy. And you know what I mean? Like facile.
Yeah. Right.
So, yeah. So it was a long time to find the right tone. And I've already written novel number 2, and it's a modern novel, so I was able to use cool colloquialisms from today and stuff, cell phones and cable TV and all that. So it was a lot of fun. But yeah, it was a lot of work doing it, you know, in a period time for sure. But well, I mean, it also brings a lot of rewards. That spiritualism is just so fascinating. I think everybody's fascinated by that.
Yeah, and what a time frame to put that in. Well, you did it really well. And if you had to go back and rewrite, that would have been an extra chore. I experimented with that whole idea of writing in another time frame and trying to write that way with I did a story, Just Retribution. And I wanted that very same feel like you're talking about. Because, I mean, it's not easy to read Lovecraft, and it's not easy to read Poe. I mean, I had students who would be turned on to Edgar Allan Poe, and frankly, I was very impressed when they would tell me that, because it isn't easy. And their whole timing of how they get to the point of stories, or they get to the scariest points, you have to be a patient reader.
Right.
And you have to be willing to work to get there. And language is often antiquated. So to imitate that, but yet, you've got modern readers and you don't want to put them off too much. But I wanted to capture the feel of that. So I don't even know if that was successful or not with that story. It's actually going to be in another, or it is in another anthology. I don't think it's been released yet, but it's about to be released. So someone else did at least accept that story of Just Retribution, where I tried to tell a story. And I also said it here in North Carolina, which I like, in Black Mountain. Although a character has to come to Black Mountain for that to happen, and said it with, the story starts out in the mental hospital here, which is true. It was actually just called the Western North Carolina Mental Institution. They had a horrible name for it in those days, but it was the second one in North Carolina. It was kind of the second of Dorothea Dix. So I have my character there, but in the early days of when that hospital had just started, and then he has his story to tell. So I wanted to capture that kind of feel, and he's a very arrogant, unreliable narrator. You really can't trust him, and that kind of thing. But it's a challenge that you're gambling with to do that. It's kind of a risk to try to tell that story. But with the Occultists, it works so well that you have the old feeling, but it doesn't seem off-putting. And when you mention that it's almost like a YA novel, I wondered about your thoughts about that. I would not consider it that, but sometimes people, I think, tend to say just because a main character in a book is a young adult, that it's a young adult book. And that's not always right. That's not always accurate. So what are your thoughts about that?
No, you're right. I mean, it's not as easy as just having a teen be your protagonist. But on the other hand, I'm writing the YA book now, the fantasy I mentioned earlier, and I've done some research, and there's some scary ass YA books out there. There's some, kids today are ready for anything.
Yeah.
So you can pretty much free your brain as far as that goes. I would say sex is probably off limits a little bit, and cursing is not good. But you can do like death, violence, a lot of crazy stuff. Some of the scariest stories we know are effectively YA, like Grimm's fairy tales. They're horrifying. Kids are used to a lot, but you're right. There's, in the Occultists, there is some adult material, let's say. So it's not suitable for kids, but I was reading Stephen King when I was, 13. That's when I discovered him, when I was in 8th grade. So I think kids are pretty resilient. So, I would just say, just tell your story the way you're going to tell it, and and let the chips fall where they may afterwards.
That's probably really good advice. I think, because I'm toying with that idea as well too, and with not only the book that I want to write, although it won't be YA, but I want to do. It made me think of something. I without giving away too much, I really do want to write about Edgar Allan Poe. It's going to be that time period, and do kind of a historical fiction about a phase of his life. But the Poe idea, he's just such a troubled and dark figure, and his death is a mystery still. There's so much about him. But what about and really fictionalize it, what about Edgar Allan Poe as a youth? And so I thought about letting kids connect with him and maybe do a podcast series of stories that would be very fictionalized, but still loosely based on some of his stories that might have given him the idea for stories, but have this very deliberate YA season of Dark Corners, which was about Poe as a young person having different experiences, and give him I won't go into some of the things I've thought about, but I'm thinking but I think your advice is really good. Just go ahead and tell the story, and then let people decide whether they think it's YA or not.
Right. And I love that idea. I think that's fascinating. And I love how I can see the English teacher coming out. You're a ham. I can so you perform these things for your podcast, don't you? You're basically acting and performing them as you read them.
Yeah, it has that definite flair. That is the feel to it. And it is a narration. But I am reading it. And I loved reading to students, and for the most part, I think they'd often say, well, could you read this to us? And I would do it sometimes, but again, you're also teaching reading, and you want to just give them a taste of things and let them read on their own. But there is that. And then, but the background music that gets added to it, and then adding sound effects, I went that route, even though some people like just a straight narrative. I appreciate that people want that. But I couldn't stand it for myself, though, just listening to me read, even as dramatically as I would try to be, adding some sound effects to it and adding some music, soundtrack kind of music. It really was just movie soundtrack from Mombi Ullman. Boy, it took it to another level. And that was just really so much fun. But yeah, you're right. It was a performance, and teaching for me was often a performance. I think I was a kind of a ham in the classroom. And yeah, the stories that you may have heard, because we found out we had mutual friends, and some of those may have been students that I've taught in the past.
They were.
But hopefully they had good memories of that, and that they enjoyed things, and that they felt, first of all, that it was a safe place to be. That is absolutely a teacher's priority these days, and it always has been, a safe place, but something that then excites you about learning. And if I was able to get anybody excited about learning and about teaching and about writing and reading, then I feel like I accomplished something. That was the whole goal.
No, they were really great. I mean, a lot of my friends were like, yeah, let me tell you a funny story next time I see you about David Voyles. But, and I think that's another thing I appreciate about your writing is it does feel like a safe space. I mean, as a person of the LGBT persuasion, it's always nice to feel included, and I really felt included when I was reading your work. It obviously is written with a, sort of a conscientiousness that is very accessible and very open and very careful in its inclusiveness, rather than an exclusiveness, which is sometimes rare. It's rarer than you think. You can tell, pretty quickly if you're trans or gay or bi or lesbian, and you can tell where the writer's head is at. And it's really a joy to read a writer that has so much compassion, so much openness, so much tolerance, but at the same time is wanting to just scare the shit out of you. And so that's what I found in your work. So,
well, that's been a real goal, was to not necessarily be conscious of like, gee, I think I should write a story that has a gay character in it, or to be, racially aware of that. But I do, but it's almost like I want them to be as in life. Sometimes, like the main character of the 13th day of Christmas does happen to be African-American, and yet no, you don't need to know that, and you can read the whole story and not know that. But I knew that. I know that certain characters are gay in my stories, and I don't know whether people know that or not, because that isn't the thing that defines them.
Right.
There's something else there. There may be something that's very important. There's an aspect of their lives that has an impact on them, but it's also been a challenge, or something I've been, as a writer, that you worry about to some degree. If you're this, here I am, 66 years old, white cisgendered guy trying to do that, do you blow it? Should you just stay away from it altogether? But I feel like, no, I've just got to write life the way it seems to me. And hopefully it comes across genuinely. And as you said, if you're coming from a place with compassion, basically, and openness, even though you're willing to kill them just like you're willing to kill anybody else, it's just, that's the inclusive world that we need to have. And I think the literature that you write should just be that inclusive as well. So hopefully it comes across, like you said. I appreciate those comments more than you know.
Well, that's good. I don't know how much time we have, but I mean, you don't want to just kind of put a character in there as like a cardboard, one-dimensional.
Yes.
What I mean?
It's time to have,
So it was really great.
Cool. Are there? I mean, we could go. It'd be fun. You put two writers together like this. We can go all night with things of a discussion. But I don't want to exclude if there have been some questions that people had. Stephanie, are there?
Here's the thing, y'all. I would be more than happy to just listen to you talk you know, for however long you would like to. I hear myself say that quite often, but I honestly only say it when it's true. just so you know, like when I'm like, and you've been great. Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions, actually great questions from Patricia. And before I read out those questions to you, I just want to just thank you so much. You know, this has been a wonderful conversation. I would love for us to do it again sometime, which, you know, whenever the next one of you that has another book out, well, maybe we can pair you up again. Because we've certainly enjoyed it, and it seems like you have as well. This has been really
great. Absolutely. This is fun. This is real fun.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So so first question, Patricia says, I recall an interview with filmmaker Roger Corman in which Bruce Campbell, I don't think we have to contextualize, maybe we do have to contextualize Bruce Campbell for people, but not for me, asked him what he preferred more gore or less gore. Corman said less because the viewer fills in the horror with what in their minds they are most afraid of. So how do you approach that issue of gore in writing horror and the reader?
You know, Polly's got the film and writing thing. I'd be interested in Polly's answer.
Yeah. Well, your imagination is always scarier than anything on the page. And so I think that's what David was getting at when he said he doesn't have a lot of gore in his books. And I think it's a wise decision, because the more you show, the less imagination the reader brings to it. So you have to be very careful about parsing that information out. And gore is easy. Gore is simple, you know. What's really hard to do is scaring the hell out of somebody without gore and without, without any tricks. And so I think it's a higher, form of art. And so gore doesn't interest me. It's nice when a story has teeth, when you're not afraid to go there, so to speak. But at the same time, gore is gore. It's easy. It's cheap. It's my opinion.
I'd have to agree. I wonder if there are new types of horror, at least new to me, that I wasn't aware of until I really delved into it and started trying to see what kind of horror was there. And there's definitely a whole genre of extreme horror and body horror and all kinds of things, which I don't want to put down. I'm not going to try to judge whether anything's legitimate or not, but I know what I like. And I know what I think is a challenge. And as you said, I don't think it's as hard to write those kinds of things. But I wonder, like even filmmakers today, do they get challenged in that they have to have, because we're talking about those Corman movies, that's been a while. Can you still get by without actually showing gore in making movies? And one of the things, I don't know, Polly, how you feel about this, but one of my favorite things in recent years was a Netflix movie, the series of The Haunting of Hill House. I thought that was done so well. I love the storytelling. I love the way that horror was done. That's the essence of it for me. And I felt like, boy, they nailed it with that.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. And Roger Corman, of course, he was almost an exploitation filmmaker. He was famous for, 10,000 Maniacs or 2,000 Maniacs, I think it was called in the day. And so he was into almost, I hate to use this word, but he was like a pornography of gore. That was what it was all about. At the time he was making films in the late 60s, we hadn't seen someone get their arm sawed off or something like that. And of course, George Romero with Night of the Living Dead in 1968. That was a real shocking movie at the time because it was the first film to show that gore. So there's a time and a place for that stuff, but I think we've been there and done that. And I think the more interesting work, like Haunting of Hill House, Mike Flanagan, the filmmaker, is being done by people who sort of show it when they need to, but move on from it.
Yeah.
Thank you both for that. And I'm with you. There is a time and a place for sure, but it's certainly not necessary. And I feel like the gore that you do get when there's less of it is that much more sort of effective,
right?
In terms of setting the tone that you need to set in that moment. But I always I always find it scarier when it's really more the atmosphere, like you've both talked about previously, which is hard to do, and especially when you're I'm more easily scared on the page than I am on the screen. As well. There's something about reading along. I feel much more immersed in a book, reading something that's scary than I do watching it. And so I have kind of a lower tolerance for gore on the page than I do on the screen somehow.
That's interesting.
Hereditary?
Yeah. Don't know, but it's just something I've discovered. It's harder, it's harder for me to read. Patricia says it is hereditary.
Oh my God.
It's harder to read that than it is to watch it. Like I can watch zombies eating people all day long, and it's just like, that's not real and it's fine. But like reading things that are really viscerally written and gory is a lot more challenging. I didn't mean to make that about me, but I'm just your comments were just really insightful. And I think a lot of people can share in those thoughts. So we've got another question. David, this one's for you. Specifically, how did you develop your unreliable narrator? Patricia's mentioning that she really enjoys that.
Yeah, that's a good question, because that character, especially in Just Retribution, was the one that comes to mind. And I think because I wanted to capture a style and a storytelling style that was very much like Poe, and so Poe definitely had the unreliable narrator, but I wanted to have this character who was mad, and take you with him on his journey. He has a recurring nightmare that it just becomes an obsession with him, where he's this house. It's the ultimate haunted house, and it literally haunts him till he has to find it because he feels like it really exists, and he has to travel to the spot where he's just is brought there. But you can't trust what he says, because I love that about Poe. I love that his characters are people that you have to say, well, we got to take a little bit of this with a grain of salt. I've got to look a little bit beyond that character. I have a friend who teased me about the story Just Retribution because I actually used some real names from history. The Black Mountain is a little community right next to Asheville, as most of you know, but if some of our listeners might not know. And there was a Black Mountain hotel, the first hotel that was there. Actually, the town was not called Black Mountain in its earliest days, but that hotel was run by a man, and I used the actual name. And my friend said, "That's my ancestor. You made him seem like he was and he was teasing me. He was laughing about it. And so you made him seem like he was idiotic or something." I said, "No, not at all. He's actually a very cool character, but the narrator is a guy we can't trust." And that was his take on it. He just didn't like this, what he figured was a talkative fool that was just saying too much. So, there was that quality of that narrator being that way. But I definitely was influenced by Poe's unreliable narrators with that particular story.
Very cool. Thank you. So it's 7, and time has really flown. Again, it's been such a joy to listen to y'all. And I know we actually because in the days of virtual events, there's a little, had to take a little technical extra moment to get started. Yeah. So I do want to do something that we like to do whenever we're wrapping up, which is ask both of you if you might have, other than each other's books and your own books, another book or two that or author that you would like to recommend. Polly, let's start with you.
Okay. I am a pretty aggressive social media user, and there's a really robust community on Facebook among weird and horror writers. And I've gotten to know some of those writers, and of course I've read their work. And there is a writer named S.P. Miskowski, and her debut novel was called Knock Knock, like knock knock. And it is the scariest, smartest, most unique book I've read in a long time. It was the first book I've had to literally put down. It was so scary I had to put it down. It was one of those books literally you don't want to read at night. And it's about a group of women who kind of unleash something in the forest. I don't want to go too far into it because she's really an amazing writer and she can set it up better than I can. But SP Miskowski, knock knock, it'll scare the hell out of you.
That's great.
Excellent.
That's a
Excellent.
great
Thank you.
reference. Thanks.
David, what about you?
Well, when I think about books that have been influential, I don't have anything that's really that outstanding that another horror writer probably wouldn't say. I mean, I really do, as I mentioned, I love Ray Bradbury because of, you just read Bradbury and you can learn, but he had Zen and the Art of Writing, I think, is influential. Stephen King's book on writing is a really good, fun read. I mean, they can be boring books, but his is actually a fun read. So I'd recommend that for anyone wanting to write horror. In terms of just another story that I've read, I'll give a shout out to my friend and the publisher of Gestalt Media, which is a independent, a little small company dedicated to independent artists, just like Malaprops. It's the same spirit of trying to help independent writers and artists. And his name's Jason Stokes. And he wrote a book first before he created Gestalt Media called Ghost Story. It's a really, truly innovative take on a ghost story. It's also a road trip, but I'd highly recommend it because it's very visual, very cinematic. It should be a movie. It's a wonderful read. And so if you look, I'm not sure, it might be at Malaprops. It probably is because Jason's a customer and follower of that. So maybe on your shelves, if not in his little company, Gestalt Media, who's again dedicated to serving independent writers. I'd give a shout out there for Ghost Story.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you both again. I'll just remind folks, if they're here with us on Zoom, Patricia has been posting all the links in chat, and I've put them over in the Facebook comments as well. And you can order The Occultists by Polly Schattel from Malaprops. You can order Tales from the Hearse. And thank you, Polly, for holding up the book, Tales from the Hearse, and The 13th Day of Christmas by David Allen Voyles from Malaprops as well. And check out our website for their recommendations also. And if you're not right here in the Asheville area and you have an independent bookseller where you are, please support them. We are all, here for our communities, and we know how important your support is, and we want to continue to be here for y'all, for book lovers and for authors everywhere. And I just look forward to the next time we have an opportunity to get you two together. So
likewise, thank you so much for having us.